Hello and welcome. Today, the World Affairs Council brings you a special program entitled White House Warriors: How the National Security Council Transformed the American Way of War. Our author and speaker today is Dr. John Gans. It's our privilege to bring you international speakers from all over the world. And if you'd like to know more about the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston and how you can join, please visit our website at wachhouston.org. In addition to our online programming, we have many programs right here in the Houston area, all centered around global education. So visit our website and be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel to see all of our international programs. Now again, joining us today is Dr. John Gans. Dr. Gans is the Director of Communications and Research at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House Global Policy Center. Previously, Dr. Gans served at the Pentagon as Chief Speechwriter to the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. He also served in the Obama administration as Senior Speechwriter for Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel and Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, Dr. Gans served as press liaison at Ground Zero, where he helped brief the press on behalf of FEMA. It was this experience that drove his interest in public service and also in national security. And since then, he has worked at the U.S. Defense Department, the U.S. Treasury Department, the Office of the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, and for the U.S. Senator Hillary Clinton. A recognized name in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy, just to name a few. And he has appeared on CNN, BBC, MSNBC, and NPR. Please join me in welcoming to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston's program today, Dr. John Gans. John, thank you for joining us.
Hello, John, and thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you all for joining us again today. An excellent event and a very important event. I think American foreign policy has changed incredibly since World War II, but a lot of people probably don't realize the full depth of how it's formed and who forms it. So John Gans's book, White House Warriors: How the National Security Council Transformed the American Way of Life, is a wonderful book. It doesn't just give you kind of a summary of kind of the major uses of American force since World War II, but really gets into the personnel and the people behind who made those decisions and how those decisions were made. So I'm delighted to host John Gans today. And John, maybe just to help people start, that I think as you mentioned in your book at one point, perhaps until Michael Flynn, a lot of the American public might have loosely heard about the National Security Council, which is led by the National Security Advisor, but they didn't necessarily know what it was or what they do. Briefly, can you talk about how the concept was derived shortly after World War II, during the Truman administration, following perhaps maybe the most effective American foreign policy president in history, FDR, why it was created and what was it expected to do, even though it ended up being much more than it was intended.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ronan, for having me, and thanks to the World Affairs Council of Houston for having me. It's great to be here on Zoom. And my only disappointment is not getting to visit Houston in person. I know it's a great town. I lived there in college for a summer, and I also know it's a very global town. I actually, one of my first jobs out of college, I actually helped Houston bid for the Olympics, the 2012 Olympics, which was a long time ago, but got to spend a lot of time getting to know the city and its strengths, and hope to visit sometime in the future. So you've asked a great question, and you sort of, betrayed your bias a bit in terms of FDR and Franklin Roosevelt as a foreign policy president. But the fact is that the NSC and the creation of the National Security Council itself and the National Security Council staff and eventually the National Security Advisor were really part of an effort to make sure somebody like Franklin Roosevelt never was able to manage global affairs the same way again. Really, FDR was sort of fought World War II really almost with just a collection of aides out of the White House. He liked to call himself a juggler, who basically kept everybody on their toes, kept his decisions very close to his vest, and really kept everybody else in the dark, even his own Vice President, Harry Truman. And though the World War II was won, how Franklin Roosevelt really tried to run foreign policy by himself without including a growing government. And with just those handful of aides and his communications with Winston Churchill scared Washington to death, right? The best example of that is that Harry Truman didn't really know about the nuclear bomb until he became president, right? This was not a government that was sharing secrets and coordinating within itself. And so after Roosevelt passed on, and the way he passed on, with the war still to be won, there became a sort of increase in conversation in Washington about needing some structure to sort of bring everybody to the table and stop the need for a president to try and do it all on his own. And so they created what was known as what is still known as the National Security Council. And this was really the effort to get the president in one room with all of the major players in foreign policy: Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, which was a newly created office, military commanders, military secretaries, and whatnot. And they really realized if you're going to get all those people in a room, you're going to need somebody to make sure they show up on time, know what they're going to talk about, and know what decisions are going to be made. So they created really just a small staff to do that. And it was a secretarial staff. And that staff was really, out of that little sort of 12-person staff, grew into one of the most powerful entities in Washington, the National Security Council staff. The staff now has about 110 members, and a very powerful national security advisor. It's had upwards of 200 or 300 staff members in recent years. And it really has become the engine of foreign policy, and was derived from that sort of concern after World War II.
And I think one of the things that's fascinating about your book is, what's excellent is in a relatively concise book, as opposed to a 600-page, 500-page tome, you present almost all of the major uses of American military force. Really, especially since Vietnam. But you don't tell it from the perspective of Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or anything like that. You tell it largely from the perspectives of some very key and influential staffers within the National Security Council. Can you talk about how it is that some of these staffers became so influential? In a lot of ways, presidents came more to rely upon them as their kind of, as Bush would say, my White House warriors, or talking about Megan O'Sullivan or others, rely upon them and their perspectives than even their own secretaries of defense or secretaries of state.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the way this sort of went down was about a decade ago, I got interested in sort of understanding the NSC staff. The introduction mentioned that I sort of got involved in national security after 9/11 and was really interested in understanding how decisions are made in government, and decided to look at the NSC staff on the hunch that they seemed really important in Washington, but I didn't really know what they did. So I said, this is what I want to figure out. And I ended up going to, I think, 6 presidential libraries, including a couple in Texas. I looked at about 10,000 original documents, so deep into the archives, and interviewed I think about 100 people at the end of the day, from everybody from Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney to Susan Rice and H.R. McMaster. And what I tried to do is just find out what these staffers did. And what you see is that as government grew, right, World War II, the national security state really there was no CIA, there was no Air Force, there was no Defense Department, right? There were separate departments of the Army and departments of war, right, which is the Army, and departments of the Navy, right? And so what you saw is as government grew, the presidency needed to assert more and more control. And they started to use the NSC as a means of doing that. And really, even from the start, there was a battle over what the NSC staff would mean, if it would be a product of the presidency or a product of government. And there's a perfect example of, the first Secretary of Defense, a guy named James Forrestal, who's pretty famous. He was the first Secretary of Defense, and he had been Secretary of the Navy during World War II. And, when I worked at the Pentagon, I always sort of reminded people when I would give tours to friends and families that they built the Pentagon during World War II, right? They built the biggest office building in the world while we were fighting a war. It sort of shows you the scale of the enterprise. And, James Forrestal, when they created the NSC staff, went over to the White House and in sort of a casual way said, we have all this office space. Why doesn't the NSC staff just come over and sit with us, right? We have this huge building. Why don't you sit with it? And the White House knew exactly what it was doing. They said, no. They're a product of the president. They work for the president. They're going to sit at the White House. And so over the years, as the power of the presidency grew, the power of the staffers grew. And more and more, and especially during wars, as the complexity of foreign policy grew, presidents couldn't do the hands-on juggling that they were expected, that they maybe wanted to. And so these staffers became more and more involved. And what you see is, I sort of like to say, I looked at an NSC staffer, or in some administrations, several, from Truman to Trump. And what you see is that in every war, there is a staffer who becomes the point person on it. And because of the White House's unique place in Washington, they kind of get to see the whole war, right? Not just the view from the Pentagon, not just the view from the State Department, not just the view from the CIA. They come to have a tremendous amount of influence, at least information. And then because they work for the president, they have a tremendous amount of influence, because all they have to really do is convince him to do something, and they can change the whole direction of the war. So it's kind of a, from Vietnam to Beirut to the Gulf War to the Balkans, Afghanistan and Iraq, we just see NSC staffers time and time again sort of rising to the moment, and for good and for ill, changing the course of history.
And your book does an excellent job of presenting really effective and, I suppose, controversial NSC staffs and national security advisors, both from Democratic and Republican administrations. Going back to Vietnam, whether it's Kennedy or LBJ or into Nixon. Maybe we could talk about maybe one of the most egregious examples of the National Security Council, and specifically, I suppose, the National Security Advisor, far exceeding their purview in terms of what they're supposed to do in terms of advising the government. If you could talk about, I suppose, Kissinger and his National Security Council, or in a lot of ways, really, Kissinger was a party of one. He was the foreign policy establishment, really beholden to Nixon, and how the National Security Council itself was conflicted underneath Kissinger, and how it completely broke down the process of kind of civilian and military input and control.
Yeah. I think that if Henry Kissinger really made the National Security Advisor job, which is not, there's many little complexities to the story, but National Security Advisor isn't actually the title of the job. You are technically the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. That's the job. And LBJ, in his Texas style, just started calling it the National Security Advisor job. And that became what it became known as. But Henry Kissinger made it a household title. Like, if anybody put the job on the map, it was Henry Kissinger. And what's really funny about Henry Kissinger is that he was able to recruit at the time probably the best credentialed, we'll say the best credentialed NSC staff in history, because people really believed that with somebody that smart and that engaged and that sort of academic and deliberative, they thought he would run maybe the best staff in history. And so everybody wanted in on the action. And what they found is, when they all sort of showed up, is they had nothing to do, because Henry Kissinger just didn't trust anybody to do anything. And so all they really became was really first drafters for his stuff. They would write memos, and then he would take the parts he liked and submit them under his name, sometimes famously changing the conclusions. They would write deeply pessimistic memos. People like Mort Halperin, who was an old friend of his and a colleague of his from the Harvard, or Tony Lake, who was a young Foreign Service officer who would then go on to become National Security Advisor. He would take their deeply pessimistic memos about the war, and then he would change them and say, the conclusion, and say, but we can still win, and things like when he was writing to Richard Nixon. And so what he became was he really condensed all access to the president to go through him. And Richard Nixon wanted it that way. That was how he wanted it, and he was comfortable with it, and he allowed him to do it. And really, as a result of that, it became a very distrustful, disgruntled place. And there were a few times during 1969 where it looked like Nixon was going to fire Kissinger, because the staff was miserable and leaking to everybody. And what you see is that Henry Kissinger, in many deals with the devil he's made in his life, basically went to war against his own staff to try and keep his own position, including, the first wiretaps of the Nixon administration were not on the Democratic National Committee. They were on NSC staffers who were considered disloyal. Henry Kissinger authorized a wiretap on the home phone of one of his old friends, Mort Halperin, who was the first person bugged in what would eventually be known as the Watergate scandal, right? And that wiretap was left on his home phone for 21 months. People were listening to his home phone calls. And even though he left the White House, I think it ended up being like 5 months after the wiretap went on, they kept it for another 16 months on his home phone. And, it's very funny. I mean, what's funny about that is that I interviewed Halperin for the book, and, he sort of laughed. He said, the funny thing about it is I lived around the block from the reporter they claimed that I was leaking to. So he's like, they weren't ever going to catch me in the act of leaking on the phone. I could have just walked around the corner and told them what I wanted to know. He said, but Mort Halperin, ended up suing Henry Kissinger and winning a lawsuit against Henry Kissinger. It took him almost 15 years to win the lawsuit, but eventually got an apology letter for him. But what you saw is that Henry Kissinger, in an effort to have power and keep his access to President Nixon, was willing to break government and break his own staff. But what happened over the long term is those that stayed on Kissinger's good side and were willing to do whatever he wanted really rose in power. And those that had any doubts and questioned his ideas sort of fell off and slowly left Washington, left government.
And I think the office has, very good examples of, I suppose, the NSC's, going a bridge too far. And, shortly maybe just turn to examples. You mentioned 1990s, perhaps the best examples of NSC and foreign policy with people like Richard Haas and others for the Gulf War, and then later under Clinton for, the policies towards Bosnia. But can you just to help people understand the national security advisor, let alone national security staff, are not positions that have to be vetted by Congress. They don't have to be approved by Congress. They don't even have to be questioned by Congress. And can you explain that and maybe how it lends to part of the reason why a lot of people feel they're unaccountable and they're unknown?
Yeah. So, what I think most people realize, and most people, if they didn't learn about the National Security Advisor or National Security Council staff, really, from Henry Kissinger, they learned about it from Ollie North, right? And Ollie North, who was famous for the sort of wrongdoing that went on during the Iran-Contra affair of the Ronald Reagan NSC staff, in which Oliver North and a few others were both trading weapons to elements in Iran to try and release American hostages there, and then taking some of the proceeds of those and funding Contras who were fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, right? This was a complicated scheme, and Oliver North was really running it with a few friends on the NSC staff in the mid-'80s. And what you sort of saw is that Oliver North eventually testified under oath in front of Congress. And what's entertaining about that is that, NSC staffers that's a rarity. Ronald Reagan actually waived executive privilege so that testimony could happen. And, it was really considered a breach of protocol that happened. And what really happened after Iran-Contra is that Washington got scared, right? Washington got scared that the presidency, that people could do this under the presidency and under the cover of darkness, right? Because the NSC staff was not subject to congressional oversight the way the Defense Department is, the way the State Department is, the way the CIA is. And so the suspicion was that without this oversight, bad things could happen. And a lot of people thought deeply about whether there should be congressional hearings and congressional confirmation required to be National Security Advisor on the NSC staff. And largely speaking, Washington said no. Some of the old graybeards in Washington said, no, we're not going to get into this. The president has to be trusted with these people and has to be able to pick people he trusts. And he can't worry about them going up on the Hill and testifying. But what you saw is in the 30 years or so since that testimony is that the NSC staff grew in power in part because they didn't have to testify, right? Whereas their counterparts of the Defense Department, State Department, and elsewhere had to go and explain things when things went bad and thought about that, right? You worry about that when you're sitting at the SecDef's office. I wrote a lot of congressional testimony for secretaries of defense, and it's one of their biggest worries because they're getting, anything can happen in a congressional testimony. And so they really worry about it. And yet the members of the NSC staff can really recommend whatever they want. They never have to go explain it. And so that's one of the ways the NSC staff has grown in authority is that ability, that the fact that they don't ever have to answer for the advice they give. And it's something that I contend is a problem. And I contend that it's made it harder for Americans to see how foreign policy is made, because they don't sort of get to listen to the most powerful people in some of the conversations and ever get to meet them. And I think that it's a real source of distrust, both in government and within between Americans and their government.
And your book really is, and I don't want to, think people feel this is a complete diatribe against the NSC.
I didn't pay you, but you can.
Yeah. Your book is very balanced. It also prevents many cases where the NSC kind of performing a role that might be more typical, or at least in a manner that's more transparent and more typical, has been very effective. Maybe just pick one of those examples to go back to probably what a lot of people consider the most effective foreign policy team, in the last 30 years, I guess at this stage now. If you could go back to Bush 41's NSC team, and in particular, you mentioned Richard Haas and how he kind of a lot of ways led the discussion, even without the military, Colin Powell and others being hesitant about the decision to go to war in Iraq to liberate Kuwait.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating example, and definitely one of, I think, there are parts of this book where I was able to sort of scratch new history, just as a nature of like documents becoming open. And the Gulf War, because of the limits on, release of documents, really is probably one that's now ripe for a new look. And my book, I think, opens and exposes some new history, and really including the role of Richard Haas in the Gulf War. And so, George H.W. Bush was probably, we'll hear a lot about Joe Biden this year, but George H.W. Bush was the most prepared foreign policy president we've probably had since George Washington. There's just nobody. He was, CIA director. He was UN ambassador. He was ambassador to China. He was a Navy hero. He was vice president. It's an extraordinary CV. And his cabinet was, almost equal to him, right? Brent Scowcroft had been, who was his national security advisor, had been national security advisor for Gerald Ford, was a lieutenant general in the Air Force. Jim Baker had been Secretary of the Treasury, had been White House Chief of Staff. Dick Cheney was White House Chief of Staff and had been a member of Congress, going down the line, right? And Colin Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And despite, and they worked really well together. I mean, it's the high watermark for a reason, and it's because it's probably that team had the deepest trust of any that I studied, and I looked at every administration since Roosevelt's, and despite that, they still fought, they still argued, they still disagreed, and what happened was that you had a real belief, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, August 1990, there were people, including Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were like, this isn't our fight. The military was deeply hesitant about fighting and going to war and sort of doing the things to push, to both defend Saudi Arabia, but also push Iraq out of Kuwait. And, there was a real slow process of saying, okay, well, we're going to try sanctions and try some of the sort of diplomatic means to do that. And, after the military pushed back, George H.W. Bush committed to letting the sanctions run their course, but sort of was worried about it. And, he didn't know Richard Haas very well when he gave him the job in 1989 to be a senior director on the NSC. And, for the first year and a half of that administration, the Middle East was not the hot spot. It was Europe and the Cold War and everything else. And what you found was that Richard Haas sort of became the point person on this massive effort, right? You forget how many troops went. You forget how many countries were involved. You forget how, it became the news story of the day. The oil markets were involved, as everybody in Houston probably remembers. It was a wild few months. And through that whole time, Richard Haas was focusing pretty much on one thing, which was the clock. And he said, we can do this, but we can't do this forever. Like, you can't keep this many troops. They sent troops, hundreds of thousands of troops to Saudi Arabia to try and stop, and Desert Shield to stop the sort of Iraqi offensive from going farther. But he said, we can't do this forever. We need a way to end this. And Richard Haas was pretty smart. He also said, we also need a way to degrade Iraq's military. Iraq at the time, I think, had the fourth biggest military in the world. And they didn't like the idea of a crazy person like Saddam Hussein having that much military force. So they said, we need to get a way out of this sort of impasse, but we also need a way to degrade the Iraqi military. And so working with just a few people, Richard Haas developed what became known as the ultimatum. And it drove Colin Powell crazy. Colin Powell thought Richard Haas was overstepping his authority time and again with George H.W. Bush. And when Richard Haas sent over a memo that proposed this ultimatum to the Joint Staff, Colin Powell's right-hand man, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, certainly took the memo and in a handwriting sort of wrote, this is tantamount to a decision for war. We still think there's time on the sanctions. That's not a direct quote because I don't have it in front of me, but basically hand wrote this and sent it back to the White House and said, this is a mistake. Now, what I don't believe the vice chairman or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff knew is that George H.W. Bush had already signed off on this, kind of had already told Richard Haas, this is what I want to do. And when George H.W. Bush, despite this complaint from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Richard Haas and Scowcroft and his deputy, Bob Gates, who went on to become SecDef, agreed to a meeting to get everybody in a room. And they got everybody in a room, and Colin Powell said he was uncertain about it. But George H.W. Bush said, what do you need to give him an ultimatum? Because we're going to give him an ultimatum. And the decision was made within days of that complaint from the vice chairman. And so we saw as Haas's ideas really sort of push the United States towards that war. And he was the point person all the way through it. Do I think that war would have happened without Richard Haas? Maybe, but I don't think it would have happened in the same way.
And as you know, Powell and other military leaders, as Joint Chiefs or generals in charge of Afghanistan and Iraq, have often had hesitancy with regards to the use of force. Can you talk about how in the book you mentioned it in various chapters, and it seems to almost grown over the decades, that in many ways NSC staffers or the NSC itself have kind of taken on roles that really were not intended, whether it be diplomatic roles, designing military strategy, or even intelligence-based issues where they're actually even going to the operational level. Can you talk about some of the kind of more egregious or kind of just hard to comprehend levels, especially in terms of operational levels that NSC has gone to at some times?
Yeah, the obvious, the worst example of that is Iran-Contra, where Oliver North was running, an arms scheme and, support for a covert action in a country by himself. But you see this sort of time and again. Richard Haas, with the okay, it wasn't in the shadows or done against commands, was sent to Baghdad to try and talk the Iraqi foreign sense into the Iraqi foreign minister before the invasion in Kuwait, and thought he had done so successfully, and it turned out he didn't. It was a few weeks before, a couple months before the invasion. You have examples. I write in the book about Nelson Drew, who was an Air Force colonel who was on the NSC during the Balkans and during Bosnia, and was on the missions with Richard Holbrooke, the shuttle missions to sort of bring an end to that war. And he was in a diplomatic mission, and they were leaving a meeting. And his car skidded off the road on Mount Ingham, and he actually passed away. So he's probably the only NSC staffer to die in the line of duty. Another example is James Forrestal's son, the first SecDef, who wanted to sort of bring the NSC over to the Defense Department. His son was on the Kennedy NSC, and his son pushed for the coup against President Diem in South Vietnam that deepened America's push into Vietnam. I think, I have a great story about an NSC staffer in the Obama administration going on military patrol, putting on an Army uniform. He had served in the Army, so it wasn't totally crazy, but he picked up a rifle and went on patrol in Afghanistan, which is not what you're supposed to do when you're an NSC staffer. But the best example really is by Megan O'Sullivan, who was a young NSC staffer who sort of, got interested in foreign policy at a young age. She was a second grader and, wrote a report on Palestine when she was in second grade and got a bad grade on it. And she pretty much swore she would never make a mistake like that again. And she went to Georgetown. She worked on the Hill for a senator. She got her PhD from Oxford. And she went into government right after 9/11 and served in Iraq as a civilian and ended up on the NSC of George W. Bush. And as the war in Iraq went south, she kept pushing for the United States to dig in deeper. Even though the United States military wanted to get out of Iraq in 2006, just as the sort of escalation in the insurgency happened there, she and a few other colleagues came up with the idea for the surge and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed to get George W. Bush to agree to it, even though the commanders on the ground in Iraq didn't want to do it, even though the Secretary of Defense didn't want to do it, even though the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't do it, even though the Secretary of State didn't want to do it. She convinced the president to do it. And so she, it's an amazing example. And what I sort of argue in the book is the NSC staff watch wars really from something just like this. It's called a Tandberg video teleconference machine. And they talk to their colleagues in military installations and embassies around the world through this thing. And they look at the wars through this. And because of their detachment, they're actually very good. And because they sort of see the whole field, they see what the CIA is doing, they see what the State Department is doing, they see what the Defense Department is doing, they sort of see the whole field. They have a very good sense of when things are working. They're good graders, right? They're good backseat drivers, right? They can see it because they have a good worldview. The problem is it's very hard to manage war through a video teleconference. And they're usually, as good as they are at knowing when something isn't working, they're usually pretty badly positioned to know what should be done next. And so what you find is occasionally, Richard Haas was, arguably right about the ultimatum. And there's some who think Megan O'Sullivan's surge was a good idea. But time and time again, the NSC, when they put in that position where they say, hey, this isn't working, we should do X, their X has sort of either not worked or led to disasters. And so what I argue is that they have sort of gotten in the way of the chain of command in that way and taken over as the strategic engine of America's war management and really its foreign policy management from the position they hold at the White House.
Maybe just two quick questions. We'll get into the audience questions. In the book, you give plenty of examples of whether it's bypassing or an end run, where it's, say, key principles like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs are not necessarily even in the picture or in the conversation with the president. But at the same time, ultimately, it's the president's decision and prerogative. Can you discuss why so many of these presidents would perhaps prefer to just deal with a small staff of the NSC as opposed to maybe listen to a more seasoned or more veteran person who might be their Secretary of Defense or might be their Secretary of State?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that what is hard to appreciate unless you've worked in government is how much government is like every other office and workplace in the world. Trust is the coin of the realm. And it is, these are hard jobs. You have a tremendous amount of responsibility on you. And you have a tremendous amount of people out there who are being critical of you. And it very quickly comes to be, who you trust. And generally speaking, people want people that they trust have their best interests in mind. And there's very few people who, the president can point to and say that person is there for me. And the NSC staff is very often that person. And though they, some of them are great friends with their cabinet secretaries, it's not the same level. And truth be told, the Secretary of Defense has 1,000 things they have to do. Making the president happy is one of them, but it's, they also have 3 million people that work for them. And, Secretary of State has a tremendous amount of responsibilities and their own sort of public posture, their own public reputation, things along those lines. And so it's very nice. I mean, I sort of, right, the book's title, White House Warrior, comes from what George W. Bush called Megan O'Sullivan. And because of what she did on the war in Iraq and the surge, he called her one of his personal band of warriors, right? Because, you know, I mean, there's probably few presidents have had a deeper reverence for the people who fought in armed forces, but there were only so many people that were willing to fight for him. And at a time where everybody in Washington was telling him to give up, she was willing to tell him to keep going and try harder and come up with a new idea. And that's an attractive quality to have around. That's the kind of people you need when you're president. And I think that as a result of that trust, they get given a tremendous amount of responsibility and authority that's lent to them by the president, who has that. And some have misused it, and some have made history with it. But it is a very powerful job that is, I think, arguably, it's a job that only certain people have been able to do well, and certain people have been able to sort of operate in as well as they should.
All right, well, that's great. I'm just going to turn to some of the audience questions. One of our audience members asks, I'm trying to pull up questions. How do you view the role of the NSC under Trump? Diane Stratton says, how do you view the role of the SNC under Trump, and has it changed significantly, or despite all the turmoil we might hear about, is it largely a similar process?
No, so it's a great question, and it's been an interesting time to publish this book because I left government in 2017. Right after I had a weird tenure because the Defense Department extended a few people to help out in the Trump administration. So even though I was an Obama appointee, I got extended, and so worked in the Defense Department till April of 2017. And so I saw the sort of initial stages of it. And, I think there were a lot of people that expected that Donald Trump would sort of become captured by government. Lots of presidents have been captured by government and become sort of the government. Barack Obama came in with a lot of ideas, and government changed his opinion on some of those things. And that happens with a lot of presidents. And to a degree that, the NSC staff under H.R. McMaster, who took over after Michael Flynn was fired just after a couple of weeks, and under John Bolton, the NSC staff really did help Donald Trump accomplish the things he's accomplished. So whether it's engaging with North Korea, bombing Iran, and that includes some of the things that have gotten him in trouble, right? There were NSC staffers who were helping him in his sort of pushing on Ukraine last summer that sort of led to the impeachment and things along those lines. The NSC staff has been exposed as helping with that. And so that's the things you would expect. Unfortunately, President Trump has been rode some of the distrust of government to the White House, and sort of has taken up the fight against the so-called deep state of government, right? This is a term that's torn from Turkey and Egypt, where, there is a government that has, government officials and the military officials have sort of exerted their authority to try and change governments and change elections. Here, it's sort of a code word for sort of a handful of unelected bureaucrats in Washington sort of making decisions that, against the American people's will, and countering the duly elected president of the United States. Generally speaking, my experience in government is that, deep state really doesn't exist in any organized fashion. But, every president faces bureaucratic resistance. That's the nature of the job. But unfortunately, Donald Trump, I think, had a natural aversion to the deep state, had probably a more Rooseveltian approach to governing, in the sense of he kind of liked to do things on his own and working with a handful of aides. He didn't like big meetings and big structure. That's not his style. It's not how he ran his business. It's not how he wanted to run government. But the sort of turn in what happened with the Ukraine hearings, where some of his own staffers and some of those in government came out and testified against him, seemed to turn it up a degree, and he has gone out of his way to purge government and really purge his own NSC staff. So in the past 8-9 months, maybe 10 months, I have to do my math in my head, since really September, since the hearings, the inquiry started, he's his fourth national security advisor, which is a record in the first term, Robert O'Brien, have cut over a third of the staff. They've pushed them out and really gotten rid of anybody who they distrusted, and has really so disempowered the staff that they weren't even capable of managing the coronavirus pandemic response, right? So this huge national security issue happens and the staff's been cut by a third in 3 or 4 months. What happened was the staff wasn't ready for it. And the history of the coronavirus pandemic hasn't been written yet, but I guarantee you there's a piece of it that the NSC staff was underprepared. And including the decision to get rid of the Global Health Security Office that they got rid of, and starting in 2018. And so what you had was a huge national security issue, a relatively disengaged president. President Trump's not a foreign policy president. That's not his focus. And what happened, I would contend, and I think the evidence bears out, is that government is used to the NSC staff being there, and the NSC staff wasn't there. And so one of the many reasons this coronavirus pandemic has been such a mess, or the American response to it has been such a mess, is because the thing government is used to happening, which is the NSC staff grabs hold, runs the meetings, shares the information, connects all the dots, wasn't there. And so what you had was really the first and the biggest crisis of the NSC era happen with no NSC, or a much smaller one that was not connected to the president very deeply. And so that's one of the reasons this has been so hard. And so I sort of write in the book that if you didn't have an NSC staff, you'd have to invent one. And truth be told, Donald Trump's tried to invent one. He's created an ad hoc committee run by the vice president and another run by his son-in-law. And that's what they're doing. They're trying to connect the dots, trying to get everybody talking. But that existed until about a year and a half ago. And so he has, this has been, it's one of the sad things about writing a book about an institution that has a lot of problems. And I ask hard questions and point out those problems in the book. But, you really do miss it when it's gone.
And maybe kind of related to, thinking of COVID-19 and China. Obviously, NSC plays a role on our overall policy towards China. And, a lot of what we've talked about in the book is about, the use of military force, but obviously it plays a role in all U.S. foreign policy. And Ahmad asks, what foreign policy do you visualize when it comes to the relationship between China and Pakistan, and how the United States will balance this, especially since the Taliban will need to come back to the table?
It's a great question, and I think the build on my last question, my last response. There's the managing the coronavirus pandemic response is a massive government job, and what you've seen is that Dr. Deborah Birx, who you've seen on the hearings, she's on the NSC staff, right? She was brought over to sort of help try to bring some sanity to this in recent months. But what you worry about right now, and I think, is that another issue happens and blows up at the same time. And, China's a place, and the U.S.-China relations is a place where that could happen, and is maybe arguably happening right now, where you see this sort of, we are getting closer and closer to what, some people are calling it a Cold War with China. Relations are cooling dramatically. Disengagement is happening. Pretty aggressive rhetoric is happening. Surely cyber attacks are happening. All these sorts of things behind that we don't see. Lots of things are, this is usually the time of year when we see a lot more activity in the South China Sea. So I expect a lot more sort of aggressive actions in the South China Sea in the months ahead. And what you sort of worry about is that over the past 20 years, the relationship with China has gone from being one managed by the State Department to one being managed by the Treasury Department. And then finally in the Obama and Trump administrations being managed almost entirely by the White House. The White House, the Chinese government demands it to be managed by the White House. And the White House, because it's such a complicated relationship with security dimensions, economic dimensions, and every other dimension involved, they have generally wanted it positioned at the White House. And so I would expect that all the hawkishness we hear on the Hill and everything else, the only voice that really matters on this is probably President Trump's and the NSC's. And what you see is, one of the fun things I get to do is follow the NSC on Twitter. And they have sent out a tremendous number of very negative China messages on Twitter over the last 3 months. And it shows you that there's a very hawkish attitude in the NSC there. So I'm not an expert on Pakistan-China relations. I do think my hunch is I don't think President Trump has cared very much about the Afghanistan war. It's not been a focus point of his administration, even though there's a peace regime and things along those lines. My hunch is that that this will be, Afghanistan is one of those issues that could be a campaign issue in the next few months before the election, just because of the timing and because it's one of the things President Trump tries to take credit for is the peace process. So, it's one place that China could arguably sort of make President Trump assert pressure via Pakistan in terms of the process. So it is one of those places where the U.S.-China relationship will not play out in a nuclear standoff, but it will play out via proxies and via sort of cyber and sort of lower sort of profile sort of pressure points. And I think that's a pretty good one to sort of look out for in the months ahead. And I think it's a great question and one that I'm going to be looking at in the months ahead.
All right, great. And just for the sake of time, I just do two. They're not necessarily short answers, but two, as short as we make, two quick audience questions before we conclude. JF asks, where does the United States stand in developing an effective artificial intelligence policy, and how are we engaged with partners to consider national/international security implications of artificial intelligence?
It's a great question. I think AI is definitely one of those things that government is trying to get its head around. I think when I worked in the Defense Department, so up until 2017, Ash Carter was spending a lot of time trying to get the department to think deeply about AI, and that involved trying to rebuild relationships with some of America's tech community. That's a real problem for government in the years after sort of Edward Snowden and some of the sort of concerns over privacy. America's tech community has really disengaged from government, and that's probably gotten even worse under the Trump presidency. And so what you find is, whereas in the Cold War, the United States developed its sort of arsenal in close collaboration with industry, right? The United States doesn't have it doesn't own the military industrial complex. It works with one. And so what you found is that relationship was very collaborative during the Cold War. And what's happened is that the sharpest minds on tech and tech innovation are hired guns in Silicon Valley and in Austin and in other places in Houston and other places around the world and around the country. And what you find is that it's much harder for the government to get smart on AI now than it was 50 years ago to get smart on nuclear weapons, because the relationship is much worse. And I think it will get even worse if Donald Trump was reelected. I just think that is something, as a fact of life. So what Congress did, and you can sort of look this up, is they created a national, I always get the acronym wrong, but it's the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence that really did get some of the smarter people in government. A guy named Robert Work, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense and continued for almost a year under Donald Trump. He's just wickedly smart on technology. And Eric Schmidt, who was of Google, I believe they're the chairs with a bunch of other really very savvy tech people trying to figure out what the AI, what should AI policy be. And they've been having meetings trying to get advice, and the University of Pennsylvania, where I live and where I work, really came up with a whole proposal on ways that, one of the things, we don't have a great AI workforce. And so how to educate those in government and educate a new workforce to sort of do these sorts of things. So government is taking it seriously. It's happening the way U.S. government works, which is it's costing too much money and taking too much time. But they are sort of circling in on some advice and recommendations. And, one would hope that whoever wins the election in November will take those recommendations seriously.
And related to that, maybe last question with the audience, Alan asks, if Biden is elected president, do you see an immediate change in policy regarding American foreign policy and global leadership?
It's a great question. What I imagine that the election and the transition will look like is a lot like the transition and election after George W. Bush left, after Barack Obama was elected. I think it will be a lot of the same, a lot of people who lived through that. Joe Biden's team is a lot of people who lived through that. Joe Biden lived through that, obviously. Foreign policy will be a big agenda item for him. It's kind of who he is. It's what he's done for a very long time. He's deeply engaged in foreign policy. He was, probably one of the most deeply engaged vice presidents on national security decisions during the Obama administration. Like, that's just who he was. So I think it's going to be a primary thing for him. I do think that what you will find is the policies will take time to turn, right? Like, I think Barack Obama said turning the ship of state, it takes a long time. My hunch is they will do a lot to try and rebuild the national security workforce, which has been really decimated under the Trump administration. There's a lot of vacancies in government. And so they'll have a bigger job to do in terms of filling vacancies that, will take a lot longer just because there's so many of them. I think they will probably have a lot of challenges and not a lot of money. Eventually, the bill is going to come due for all this stimulus and all this coronavirus impact, and tax receipts will be down next year, everything. So they're going to have to do things on the cheap, and they're going to have to make hard decisions. As a result of that, the National Security Council under Vice President Biden will probably end up being one of the most influential in history because he will be very White House focused. He has worked with the NSC staff in his own history under the Obama administration and liked it, and has a lot of people who worked on it around him. And they're going to need to make a lot of decisions with a very shorthanded government. And so the NSC staff will become very powerful and will probably get much bigger. And so my hunch is that you will probably, and they will have the motive, which is fixing the things that they think Donald Trump broke. And so my hunch is you will see the most powerful NSC staff probably in history in 2021 if Vice President Joe Biden wins. And they will have a heavy to-do list to work through, reaffirming alliances, making huge decisions on China, trying to deal with this coronavirus pandemic and more.
And lastly, as your book, points out, guys, so throughout the course of the entire thing and the different chapters and all the different administrations, you very clearly point out how the National Security Council has changed the way the United States goes to war and decides to go to war, but also how we wage war, with probably less influence from basically military leadership, but also from the front lines. And also, as you note, the timing is often done on Washington's clock as opposed to the clock that might be best suited for the theater of war itself. What are your, I suppose, even if they're just aspirations, what would you hope would change with regards to American foreign policy, but also the way the National Security Council itself is run and creates policy? Obviously, there are a lot of great aspects to it, but there are issues that maybe are concerning or could hopefully maybe be augmented or changed.
Yeah, I mean, as much as changed in a year since I wrote the book, it's still the same main thing, which is, and I think we see the after effects and the impact of this with the coronavirus pandemic, which is too few Americans trust their government. And the fact is that we stand where we are today and deal with the sort of frustrations we deal with this coronavirus, because people don't believe that the government is there working for them. And I served in the Navy Reserve and I worked in government for a long time. And I can tell you, people want to get it right. And they want to do what's best for the American people. Sometimes there's a different disagreement about what's best, but it's not done out of malice or done out of, it's more a matter of disagreement over the means, not the ends. And so what I would say is that what needs to happen is they need to find a way to open government so that people can see that the people working in government are there for them. And there is no way Joe Biden will let his national security advisor be Senate confirmed, go out for confirmation. But I would argue they should, because people, in an era when everybody watches how their meals are cooked and how their businesses are run on reality shows, too few people know how government works and how national security decisions are made. And so what I try to do is open that story up for people to learn in the book. And what I think government needs to do is open up so people can see that, you know, there isn't a deep state there. There's just some deeply committed people who want to try and protect the country and protect Americans there. And I think if we could rebuild trust in government and rebuild trust within our country, that we will be stronger in the long run and safer in the long run. And so my hunch is that would do a lot more to sort of further the ends of Joe Biden's policy agenda in the long run than keeping it quiet and keeping things closed. But unfortunately, my hunch is that they will use this sort of opportunity to sort of keep things under. They'll worry about sort of exposing too much to the public. And I think that's a mistake. So my hope is that the thing they could do is open up. But I fear they will just keep everything much tighter and much more closely held in the new year.
Well, again, I highly recommend, if you can see it here, we'll put it at the end, John's incredible book, White House Warriors, How the National Security Council Transformed the American Way of War. And it is a very engaging book, very informative, but also, you know, eye-opening. I'd highly recommend it to anyone who's curious about the way American foreign policy is actually created and then how it's pushed through. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much to John Gans, and hopefully we'll host you in Houston in person at some point, and hope you all have a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.